Good morning, everybody. Hopefully everybody's having a good morning. Appreciate y'all taking the time to be in attendance for this, what should be a great set of presentations. If people don't know me, I'm Don Digman, State Bridge Engineer for GDOT, and today our presentation is all about Section 20 plans, a mindset of collaboration. Welcome, and the next couple slides will be overview and some housekeeping items. Some housekeeping: anonymous attendees will not show up on an engagement report. Please mute your microphones and keep your videos off. Questions via the moderated Q&A box input there. Don't wait at the end. If a question pops up, please enter it in as you go. Couple checkpoints: attribution if name included, anonymous if name not included. Questions will be fielded during the last 30 minutes, and type in questions at any time. As I said, no need to wait. Housekeeping continued. Sessions are being recorded. 2 PDH CEUs available for those attending the entire session. Those requests should be emailed to Gail Davino at the email provided here on the slide to request a certificate, name as you would like it to appear, name of the employer, and also the request. Please make the request within 2 weeks after the presentation. Just going through today's topics and presenters. Again, I'm starting off the batting order with Section 20, the storming phase. Again, I'm Don Digman. Section 20, a new approach. This is Chris Goodson. Permitted access construction details with Sam Woods. Construction envelope permitting with Dave Hedin. And then we'll have a wrap up and key takeaways. And lastly, but most important, the Q&A moderators with Chris Goodson and Sam Woods. So to start it off, I wanted to say the title is Storming Phase. This is going to talk a little bit about how we started and where we end up, and Chris will segue in with a new approach. The why do we do Section 20s? So it's required by GDOT PDP, and there's some updated language hopefully soon for that, and it's required by GDOT OES documentation in support of that documentation. It was initiated and required by memo by the chief engineer back in June 30th, 2014. What it does, Section 20 provides a graphical representation of the environmental permit document. Encourages early coordination between design and construction personnel that hopefully results in a viable project approach, and not hopefully, it will, with all this coordination. And also it reduces or eliminates delays during construction of having to re-permit during construction. The what details are shown on Section 20? Access roads, access details such as rock jetties, work bridge, bulkheads, barges, restrictions and timeframes as far as allowable work, bank stabilization, armoring, primarily in northern districts, notes that parallel language in the permits, and levels shown similar to Section 13 sheets. The what, just some examples as pictures: work bridges. To your left is a work bridge, what was then in Baker County. This bridge is now open. And to your right, you have a picture of a work bridge. I don't believe it's there anymore, but for the 7516 project over Okmulgee River. Again, another picture of a work bridge. This was down in, I believe, Decatur County, State Route 253, I think Spring Creek. These are rock jetties right here. On your left is the Northside Drive project, which that bridge, and along with the pedestrian bridge, is now open. And then to your right, I believe it's Coral Graves Pond. Here you've got also a unique feature. I think there's a dam as well that we had to work around, but this is a full jetty shown on the right. Barges, I believe on the left was the Lawrence County project freeway trail, and then on your right is State Route 53 over Lake Lanier. They're setting some beams there off a barge. Access roads, the one on the left is one example in access road. The one on the right, I believe it was in D6, getting your beams down to the bent area where you can install them. And if you zoom in, or if you get these these presentations, you can zoom in, and this is what we call a beam launcher in the background. Also, bank stabilization, again, to reinforce the fact that this is primarily in the northern districts, District 1 and 6, with coordination with the district construction and erosion control staff. But something you need to be key about, riprap will need to get into the water to key it in properly so that it doesn't get washed away with heavy flows. The who's involved in development of Section 20? You got the project manager who drives a lot of these processes, and in the weeds, so to speak, is the design, roadway, bridge design team members. Key aspects as well as construction, district area personnel, erosion control, the state construction liaisons. They're key to bringing their personal experience from previous projects to see what works or what doesn't work. Utilities is also important. You got a lot of utility work that crosses over ESAs that you need to account for, and certainly environmental. We're doing this coordination to make sure we have the right permits. And out of all that, making sure you get the right of way or easements to do all this work. And here the who, you've got bridge construction, the state bridge construction liaisons. And if you go to the website, which I did not get in here, there are certain regions that are assigned to the two state bridge construction liaisons. That's Travis Bennett and Michael Garner. These folks will help you a great deal as far as bridge construction practices. And in regards to erosion control, there are erosion control liaisons. I think there's a few of them. Looks like 5 or 6. Same thing. I can shoot you these, shoot over these websites where you can get these maps so you can clearly see who is assigned what region. And that I can entertain questions or hand off to Chris. Chris?
So we're going to talk a little bit about a new approach to Section 20 plans today. And some of y'all may have heard this before. We presented at the Georgia Transportation Summit. Since then, we've done a little bit more refining. And so want to kind of go through what this new approach is, where we were before that, and why we're making this change. So we can go to the next slide, Sam. The big part of this, ideally, we would have a lot more information, and we understand that we get more information throughout the plan development process. We understand that constructability has a lot to do with things like the placement of the proposed vents on bridges. And we know that we need BFIs to really be sure about what types of access we might need on a project. That being said, we have to complete our environmental studies a lot earlier in the process. Is that we were going between getting our preliminary plans, and that would really kick off both the environmental tech studies, and that would kick off the preliminary bridge design. Of course, during preliminary bridge design is when they are setting those span lengths, and they are setting the bent locations, and they would also then be doing the hydraulic analysis. And at that point, that's when we were starting to create Section 20 plans. Unfortunately, the preliminary bridge plan P6 activity overlapped exactly with the environmental tech studies P6 activity, and we were both working towards that milestone of preliminary field plan review, or PFPR. That was really causing a lot of late documents for on the environmental side because we were waiting for that information to incorporate it into our assessment of effects reports and then do our agency consultation off of that. And it was causing a lot of project delays. And so we were looking for a solution, and we talked with our agencies. We kind of explained what the issue was, and they were amenable to changing our approach to where we provided a little bit less information, but we were able to move that from the preliminary field plan review up to preliminary roadway plans. And so to do that, we had to move that conversation from, say, a constructability review meeting number 1, which was happening sometime during that preliminary bridge or environmental tech study process, or sometimes even at PFPR, up to maybe the A3M, or as Sam will talk about, maybe even getting some of that information during the concept team meeting. So those are things that we're still working out some of the details on, but this new process is going to move up delivery of those Section 20 plans from the PFPR up to preliminary roadway plans. And I think you can click one more time, Sam. So you can see that nice little animation. And we can go to the next slide. So in terms of the scoping and timing, again, we're really trying to move that still within the preliminary design phase after concepts, because A3M really is what kicks off, as you think about it from the environmental side, at least, that preliminary design phase. And so having that conversation at A3M so that we can get the information that we need to be delivered the Section 20 plans with the preliminary plans when they go to our office and to go to Bridge. So that communication is really important. It's not all the time that we have at the A3M bridge design and construction. And so that's something where there may be more reason for them to be included at that stage, and there's certainly more reason for them to be engaged at the concept team meeting. Again, Sam will talk a bit more about that. But the idea is that we are getting that information earlier, and because we're getting earlier, we understand, and our agencies understand, that we're going to have a little bit less information on those Section 20 plan sheets. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about where we currently are before we make this change, or I guess our previous approach, which I'll call it our current approach, because we're going to change it today. We were dictating exactly where those temporary work bridges or rock jetties were. We were starting to get more and more specific, having to show where those fingers were going to be to go and kind of drill shafts or remove those existing structures. And if we moved those at all, that meant that we had a lot of work to do. On the environmental side, that meant that we were potentially changing the amount of impacts. We were certainly changing the location of impacts, which can be a really big deal. On the ecology side of that, if we've got say a mussel bed there, or on the archaeology side, a underwater archaeology site, the placement of those structures is really important. Because we want to make sure that we're not having an impact. And if we are having an impact, that's just something we need to document. And one that we can't avoid, I should say. That's one we need to document. Something we need to talk through with our agencies, do that consultation, and make sure that we're clear before we move forward. So this was providing a lot of detail about the location. And even during construction, they were coming back and saying, hey, our contractor has a crane with a longer arm than that. We need to push that work bridge out further. And that required us to do an addendum and to potentially re-permit in some cases, depending on the type of structure that we were talking about. So that was our current, or I should say now previous approach. But moving into our new approach, Sam, next slide. We are going into an area where we understand that there needs to be a little bit more flexibility for that. More flexibility because we don't have all the information as early as we need the information. And we also want some flexibility for construction as well. So in this new approach, we are going to be having a conversation as early as the concept team meeting to try to figure out what information we can take our best guess at. And by hatching out a larger area, not dictating exactly where that temporary work bridge or that rock jetty or whatever the case may be is, then we're going to add a lot more flexibility. And we're not going to hem ourselves in to where we include those plans and then we've got to constantly update those plans. The goal of this new approach is that early on, we're going to set a footprint for a hatched area where you would need temporary construction access. And the goal is to never have to touch that again through the life of the project. And unless we were to learn some certain information. So along with that, we need to show avoidance and minimization. That's part of the process, the environmental process. We show an avoidance and minimization of impacts to environmental resources. As you can see here, we've got a right-of-way line that is a little bit further out. That hatching doesn't go all the way out to the right-of-way line. So typically, we're not going to need access all the way out there. And so we should not hatch areas out there unless it's absolutely needed. We also don't typically need access between the two bridges, but that's not to say that that never happens. So that'll be a conversation you need to have as well. But the other way that we really want to show that we're doing avoidance and minimizations on the environmental side is through plan notes. And so you can see each of those plan notes there at the bottom in that red box, and I hope y'all can read those all. No, I'm kidding. We're going to go through this in just a minute, but through plan notes, we are going to show some level of avoidance and minimization as well. And those are instructions to the contractor to make sure that they are only impacting the minimum amount necessary to be able to do the work that they need to do. So the goal, we had a working group and we talked with our construction folks and bridge and roadway internally to come up with these plan notes. And what we wanted to do is create template plan notes so that on every single section 20 plan sheet, we did not have to recreate that process. You wouldn't have different notes on every single section 20 plan sheet. Does that mean that you can't change these at all? No, it doesn't. You know, you're going to come across a project situation where you may need to change it for one reason or another. But our hope is that on most projects, you will just be able to use these template plan notes and never have to change them. And your section 20 plan sheets should then become very, very easy to develop. And we can go to the next slide. So that first plan note really is going to be something that never gets captured in our plans and oftentimes comes up during construction, which is really about bank stabilization. You know, I heard just yesterday in a conversation from talking to one of our district construction managers that they had a cofferdam that they had put around a proposed vent. They were building that vent. Because of that, cofferdam was a little close to the stream bank. The water flow pushed it around that cofferdam and it started to erode out the stream bank. Of course, they tried to stabilize that as quickly as they could. And we want them to stabilize that as quickly as they can before there's too much more erosion. And the way that they did that is through riprap. Through other access methods, say a temporary work bridge, sometimes they will tie those directly into the stream bank, you know, to stabilize those and keep it nice and level. And when they take those out, that bank will become a little bit unstable. So they will need to put down some type of stabilization. So this first plan note allows for bank stabilization along the stream bank, basically within the construction area. We're going to talk a little bit more about what that means and exactly where we're talking about. But this first plan note is all about that, but it also says that you only do that when you absolutely need it. You have to keep that minimized to the greatest extent practicable. So it gives flexibility to construction. It means that we are going to plan for that in our assessment of effects reports and even mitigate for that impact. But GDOT is willing to do that so that we have that flexibility during construction and we are covered. Let's talk about the next plan note. So the next plan note is really part of that minimization effort because we know that we can destabilize banks when we tie structures into them. And there's all that heavy equipment that's going back and forth from the stream bank onto that temporary access work bridge or jetty, whatever the case may be. We want to minimize the area that is going to be impacted by that tie-in. And so this tie-in says that you will not exceed 25 feet for wherever that temporary structure ties into the stream bank. And that should be enough for any size crane, any size equipment to get out onto that structure into the stream. Now, something that was missing from a lot of our Section 20 plans were those fingers that kind of come off and go approach the existing and proposed bends, because the construction folks need to get right next to that to drill a shaft to take out a existing bend. And so you can see there in that photo on the right that you've got those fingers coming off, but where it ties into the stream bank is only going to be limited to 25 feet wide. I want you to also notice in that right photo that you have access between the existing and the proposed bridge. So there are scenarios where you are going to need to hatch out that area between those two structures. And that's just going to be a conversation you need to have with construction. So I think that one hopefully is pretty straightforward. Let's move on to the final template plan note. And the third one is going to be partially something that's related to our permitting. And our regional permits through the Army Corps of Engineers say that we can only block 33% of the width of the stream channel at any given time. Now, there are some ways around that. We can do a nationwide permit that gives us a little bit more flexibility, but in general, we get much higher permit thresholds if we go through these regional permits. And so there's an advantage to GDOT to be able to use those regional permits. So when possible, we want to make sure that we are able to abide by this. That means you might have to stage rock jetties as needed. And this is primarily about rock jetties. It also can include cofferdams. So if possible, and we want to put this on the plan note, you will not block more than 33% of the stream at any given time. The next part of this template plan note says temporary jetties within streams and ESAs are or are not permitted at this location. Now, this part is where you deviate a little bit from the template. You don't include are or are not. You actually got to pick one. And so that's a conversation that we need to have early on. And Sam is going to talk a lot about how we can get an idea whether or not that's going to be the case at the early stages during concept or preliminary design. And we know that we need a BFI to know that for sure, but we're going to take our best guess early on. And we always have the ability to go back if we're wrong and update that later in the pre-construction process when we do our reevaluation. Now, the last part of that just says that fill and or temporary work structures, which could be cofferdams, debris containment structures, otherwise will just be staged accordingly. So that's going back to that initial 33%. So we want to make sure that we are having the trying to maintain flow through that stream as much as we possibly can during construction. And noting whether or not we need rock jetties, because that does have a much larger environmental impact if we're using rock jetties. And not just a larger environmental impact, there's some real associated costs with that through mitigation. So, and also through Section 7, which is what we go through with our agencies under the Endangered Species Act for species. So just keep in mind that we really want to be avoiding rock jetties whenever we possibly can. But when they're needed, we just need to know about that early on so that we can document that and we can consult with our agencies on it. But that also will bring additional special provisions onto projects. Sam, we can go to the next slide. And so this plan sheet really is showing you where we're planning on allowing access, where we are going to go ahead and permit for that. And there's 4 different zones here. And the first 3 is what I want to focus on to begin with. A is going to be underneath the existing and the proposed bridges. We know that we have existing vents that will need to be taken out. We know that we have proposed vents that are going to be, well, underneath the bridge. And so those areas, we absolutely know that the construction folks are going to need access in those areas. But we also know that we are going to potentially need to do stream bank stabilization between those two bridges. They may or may not need access there, but if they need stream bank stabilization, what you don't want to do is have riprap, no riprap, and then riprap, because as water hits that, it'll bounce off the hard surfaces, erode the soft surfaces. So if we need to do bank stabilization, we're going to need to make sure that we account for that impact, but both underneath the existing bridges, but also between the existing bridges. And then the third area is that area that allows them those tie-ins for their temporary access structures, whether it be a temporary work bridge or a rock jetty. Those based on the size of the beams that are going to go out for the bridge, based on the size of the cranes and the crane arms that are dependent on the contractor, what equipment they have or do not have. That can vary a bit, but Sam is going to talk about some ideas that we have about how to maybe standardize that as well to make this process a little bit easier. But we want to make sure we go out far enough to make sure that no matter what equipment you have, no matter the size of the beams that are likely to be used on a project, that we're accounting for enough space. And in those areas, again, we need to make sure on the ecology side that we are accounting for that as an impact because of potential bank stabilization. So in A, B, and C, all of those zones, we are going to account for bank stabilization, which will be a permanent impact, a permanent fill impact. And that will extend up to 5 feet or so outside the actual stream channel down in below the ordinary high water mark. So basically into the stream. Those areas that they are going to have access out into the stream are going to be underneath the existing and proposed bridges, and again, in those C areas. So A, B, and C, all about the bank stabilization and those other areas that are within the stream, about where they're actually going to be allowed to have access, where those fingers are coming off of temporary work bridge, etc. Now, there's been a lot of talk, especially in our GDOT's northern districts, that we need a lot of bank stabilization extending all the way up underneath the proposed bridge. And that is very important to know. In fact, we want to make sure that that's included on the plans, just not the Section 20 plans. The Section 20 plans are all about access and where we may need stabilization because of that access, temporary construction access that we have on projects. D is really more about a permanent fill, that permanent riprap that is going to protect the that slope and the bridge for the life of that bridge. So we want to make sure that that is included, and we have that conversation very early on in the process so that we understand and account for that. As you can see on this plan note, we have a wetland that extends outside of the stream, and all that impact from the fill underneath that's proposed, that would be captured on the main line or on the erosion control plans. And so we need to make sure that as ecologists, we're accounting for that and asking that question if there will need to be that fill impact there. And on the construction, on the design side, we need to make sure that we're asking that question and showing that on the plans. So that we make sure that we document and coordinate and permit accordingly. Next slide. So this new approach is really great. It adds a lot of flexibility to construction. It means that it's going to be very straightforward on the ecology side to document, because we know exactly where impacts are going to be from the beginning of tech studies and not well into them. But there are some exceptions. There's some times when this new approach is not going to work, when we're going to have to revert back to our old approach, which is knowing exactly where the structure is, what that structure is, down to even how many piles are going to be driven for a temporary work bridge and where those piles are going to be driven. And the main time that that's going to be the case is when we have involvement by NOAA fisheries. And that's typically where we have sturgeon issues, either the short nose or Atlantic sturgeon. And NOAA Fisheries is very, very particular about what conditions need to go in. And so those conditions will be based on the type of work bridge that we have. If we have a jetty or temporary work bridge, whatever the case may be, they need to know all the exact details, and they will put in a lot of provisions into our special provision 107.23H to make sure that we are meeting all of the conditions for that species. So know that on some projects, this new approach is not going to work, and so it's really important to engage the consultant or GDOT ecologist on a project to make sure that we don't have some of these issues before we go down the development process of these Section 20 plans. The other time, we just need to keep in mind, and this is not really an exception so much as when we have that alternate approach of using rock jetties or any other type of temporary fill, whether it be a bulkhead or anything like that in a stream, we just need to make sure that that is absolutely necessary, because what comes along with that is that we are going to increase the number of restrictions that we put on a project through our special provision 107.23H. So we want to make sure that we have had that coordination, and not that we can't go back and change that if we say if with the BFI we find out that there's not enough stable soils for a temporary work bridge to drive those piles. We can always go back and change that, but we really want to try to minimize the use of rock jetties whenever possible. And again, if you have to restrict more than 33% of the stream flow at any given time, maybe you have a really small stream, but you know you're going to need a cofferdam in there that's going to block more than that, or a rock jetty that because we have a bent out in the middle of the stream, you need a rock jetty, you're going to block half the stream. That's okay. We just need to know that early, and then you would modify that plan note to say what percentage of the stream would actually need to be we would not need to obstruct. So if it's, you know, a vent out in the middle of the stream, you take that 50% and up that plan note to that. So you may in some cases need to modify those plan notes as I mentioned, but we want to minimize that to the greatest extent practical. Next slide. And Sam, this is going to be a series of bullets. So yeah, and the first one, some of the benefits of this new approach is that we are going to get those early with the preliminary roadway plans. And that is going to mean that we are not going to have the same delays that we have on during environmental tech studies. That means all those projects that require bridges are not going to be held up by waiting on Section 20 plans. We get them early. And then as needed, those plans can be revised throughout the plan development process if, say, something comes up during the bridge foundation investigation. But the idea is that we really kind of get that area hatched out large enough to where the plans never need to change. And so you create them early on with very little detail and you never have to change them. So that's the goal. And it's really congruent with another initiative that you're going to hear about today from Dave Hedin, the Construction Envelope Permitting Initiative. And I'll leave that there because I know he's excited to talk to you about that. But during construction, this has a lot of benefits as well, meaning that you're going to have a lot of flexibility in the placement of where those temporary work structures are. And you're not going to have to come back to environmental if you want to change that. You also have the ability to quickly, efficiently, and without going through environmental, stabilize those banks. So if you do have an unanticipated destabilization of any of those stream banks, whether it's a cofferdam that kind of pushes the water flow out and erodes that stream bank, whether it's where you have a tie-in, you'll be able to do that. And you're going to be able to do that between the existing and proposed bridges. And you're also going to be able to do that out to where you have those temporary work structures tying into the stream bank. And on the environmental side, the big advantage to this is that we're going to reduce the number of times that we have to redocument and re-permit for what really usually amounts to very minor changes to 404 impact. So this is a huge, huge benefit to the design, to construction, and also to environmental as well. And so we're pretty excited about this new approach. And I think that might be it for me, Sam. And I think Sam is going to tell you all about how this process is going to take place. So really appreciate the time, and please put questions into the chat. And once Sam is done, we'll come back to those for any questions for me, Don, or Sam. Thank you.
Sam Woods with GDOT Roadway Design. I'm one of the assistant state roadway design engineers, and I'm here to talk also about Section 20 plans with two major topics, PDP milestones and guidance, both guidance that's available now and guidance that will be soon published. I do want to use this opportunity to introduce some new vocabulary. I know this is kind of an ongoing inside joke somewhat that we have at GDOT, but these plans have been affectionately known as Section 20 plans, and I do kind of anticipate that they still will carry that nickname. We did want to formalize it into some sort of title because of it, there's going to be information shown in the construction plans on the title block. There's going to be PPG or plan presentation guidance written for this. So the formal name of these sheets is going to be permitted construction access details, but that can be taken as synonymous with Section 20 plans. Okay, again, two major topics, PDP milestones, piggybacking off a lot of what Chris has already talked about, but specifically in reference to the PDP. I plan to talk about the PDP within the context of the recently published Appendix O, which defines the design and environmental coordination touchpoints. So as we've been putting this presentation together, I've started to categorize these milestones into three different buckets, if you will. One of them is the primary goals or target milestones, which basically means what is our main objective here? And how do we get there? Well, there's certain milestones that I'm considering to be development or coordination milestones, and then other ones to be check milestones, basically checking back in, do our assumptions hold that we made early in the design process? And as far as guidance goes, I'm going to be talking about two main things, the plan presentation guide and the PDP manual. So let's get into the PDP milestones themselves. These are those same three categories I mentioned, target milestones, development milestones, and check milestones. So the two main ones that we're concerned with are the submit preliminary plans to GDOT offices, and in this case, we are specifically talking about to environmental services to begin tech studies, and then the environmental lockdown plan submittal. So, really you could consider these in some sense to be the draft version at preliminary plans and the final version at lockdown. But as Chris mentioned, really our goal is to have the final equal to preliminary. In other words, the lockdown Section 20 plans are the same as the preliminary plans, lockdown plans. So the development and coordination milestones, the two critical formal meetings that typically occur before this submission of plans to GDOT offices are the concept team meeting and the A3M, or the avoidance and minimization measures meeting. We're going to dive into those a little bit more in more detail than in slides. And for check milestones, I'm including constructability review meetings and field plan reviews. Now, this might seem counterintuitive, especially considering the previous mindset. Am I really standing here saying that we're going to develop this set of plans that its main purpose is to identify temporary construction impacts before the constructability review meeting? Yes, that is what I'm saying. Because this new process with additional flexibility, it has buy-in from the agencies, we feel that this is a doable task. I'll probably be repeating this idea many times throughout my presentation, but this concept is not to say that you should not hold a constructability meeting if you can. It's just to say that the typical project development might not allow for that to happen, and we still believe that you can get this quality Section 20 plan without it. Field plan reviews are a little bit more straightforward item, and we'll talk about those on the next slide. So the next slide is a graphical representation of what we're looking at right now. This is what I mentioned before about the PDP Appendix O. So what you're seeing left to right on your screen is a project moving through the pre-construction process through concept, preliminary, and final. and major milestones that occur that are critical to design, environmental, and delivery in general. So let's just rehash what we just went over. The target milestones are these two here. Submit preliminary plans to GDOT offices, and then and then to have that be finalized at the lockdown plan submission. Again, the goal being no changes in between those. The development milestones occur both before that initial submission, which is the concept team meeting or concept report layout, and the 8th RIAN. So the check milestones, PFPR occurs after this. So, and we're going to go into a little bit more detail here. There will be an opportunity to check back to make sure our assumptions are sound. Typically, the FFPR is too late to make any changes because of the way the template is set up. Typically, FFPR is held after lockdown plans are submitted. Again, I'm speaking in generalities, and this is not to say that it's not a great practice to attempt to hold the FFPR prior to lockdown plans. And if you can, then you're just cranking up the quality that much more. Constructability review meetings are not on Appendix O specifically, so I've put them here, I've added them here, recognizing that they can float in the schedule, and that sometimes a second constructability meeting is needed in final design after the BFI is received. So again, to reinforce this point, a lot of times projects struggle to even hold the constructability review prior to PFPR, and they tend to sometimes be tempted by the convenience of merging those two meetings. Well, we're talking about a submission even before PFPR, the preliminary plans to other offices. So it's an even further challenge to hold a true formal constructability review prior to that. If you can, that's wonderful, and it should be encouraged. One possible compromise situation or best practice in that scenario would be for the designer to gain a little bit more comfort by some sort of informal check-in with construction and bridge through things like hatched plan view layouts and maybe a typical section here and there, but not the full-blown staging plans. So the next few slides, I'm going to be walking through the milestones I just mentioned. And for each one, to varying degrees, we're going to be talking about things that can be discussed, what information is available to the project team at that point, and also to reinforce some of these facts of our approach, also want to identify information that's not typically known with 100% confidence at these various intervals. So please keep in mind that as we go through these slides, my intent is not to say this is the focus of these various meetings, like the concept team meeting or the 8th RIAN. It's really just to say that this is how the Section 20 concept can be applied at these various milestones. At the concept team meeting, we should be asking questions like this. How will existing bridges be removed, assuming there are some on the project? And how will the contractor access the site, just like we saw in pictures in the previous presentation? It's all really getting down to this one specific question that I'd like to kind of draw your attention to the framing and choice of words here, saying based on the information available to them at this early stage, does the project team recommend one of two things, either planning to allow the use of a rock jetty or not, essentially. So we are not asking for a commitment. As Chris mentioned many times, there are opportunities to go back for the hopefully few times we don't properly account for all these variables. But we are instead asking the question, should we plan to allow the use or should we plan to not allow the use? Why are we asking this question so explicitly? This what you're seeing in the bottom of the screen is a screenshot of that third general note that's going to be applied to the Section 20 plans template. So this will help the designer fill this out and also set the environmental coordination on the right path moving forward. So I am by no means an expert in these topics. We'll have opportunity for questions after this and following the meeting, but here are some general considerations when it comes to rock jetties. In general, we recommend planning to account for them, again, as an option when there is less than 10 feet of stable substrate above the bedrock. Now we understand that that's something we don't know for sure at this exact location until the BFI, which doesn't happen until final design phase, and we're not even in preliminary design phase yet. But there are indicators we can use to make a reasonable educated guess about this. And one of those indicators is exposed bedrock in the surrounding area, which you can determine from a site visit, as you can see in these photos here. You can also notice in those same photos that it's pretty easy to tell that these are spread footings. And even without going on the site visit, you can look up that information on the bridge inventory reports or the SINA reports. Another opportunity, if there's an existing bridge, is to research the project history and find the BFI that was performed for the existing bridge, and that can tell you a lot of great information. And as Chris mentioned before, due to the mitigation costs and environmental impacts, in general, jetties should rarely be considered for use outside of this case. Again, understanding there are cases where that will not apply, but as a general rule, this is what we're recommending. So this is the focus of the discussion we feel at the concept team meeting. Just to remind everybody, what sources of information do we have? Many of you might, or I hope you're not offended at the simplicity of some of these slides, but I just want it to be a reminder that a lot of this stuff does exist, at least in the form that we can start talking about it intelligently. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, the site visit is invaluable for noticing things like presence of bedrock and the characteristics of the crossing itself, the water depth and the channel width. If there is an existing bridge on the project, you've got opportunity for a lot of information related to that, as I mentioned before, the bridge inventory data and the BFI. At a team meeting, we should be looking at a draft report and layout. And these things, again, seem very simple, but we like to think that they're in line with the simplicity of this approach, because so much of defining this hatched area is based on the bridge locations. Well, at concept, we should be looking at a proposed horizontal alignment that we have pretty high confidence in, and we should know the proposed bridge width and length. So with those few variables, we can start piecing this puzzle together to get to section 20, plan sheet developed by the time we submit plans to environmental protect studies. There are things we don't know. We do not know the proposed bridge span configuration. And by that, I mean the location of the vents, and we do not know the substructure type. And the substructure type, which we won't know for sure until we get into final design with the BFI. Again, we have hints on these things, especially if there's an existing bridge nearby. So the idea here is to make an educated guess with the information we have, not to say we won't know for sure until we have the BFI. And many times we recognize the proposed vertical alignment is still not finalized. And we're recognizing that fact and still saying we can move forward with the development of these plans. Okay, so next slide, we're going to move on to the next meeting, which is the A3M, or the Avoidance and Minimization Measures meeting. Again, this is the second of the two coordination milestones, as I'm calling them. And the main question we want to answer here, or not really even answer, just discuss in enough detail so that the designers can put this together by submission of plans to OES. And this is piggybacking again off Chris's presentation. What is the approximate width or lateral distance outside of the bridges that's anticipated to be required for construction access? So this is a screenshot of Chris's slide here, where I'm just attempting to further clarify that these red arrows are what we're trying to figure out. We anticipate this setting the basis of the footprint of this permitted access area. We know we should have a pretty good idea where the proposed bridge is going to go. We know exactly where the existing bridge is. And based on that baseline information, we're going to build off of that and make our best educated guess on what this hatched area will look like. Again, forgive me for repeating a lot of Chris's presentation, but to reinforce it, not every section 20 plan will look like this. Some will have areas hatched between the bridges. Some projects will only have areas hatched on one side of the bridge. And I do want to mention that we are not looking for precision at this stage. What we are looking for is a comfortable width that we feel can accommodate the most likely span lengths on the project and the ability to construct them with reasonable methods. So we intend to do a little bit more research on this, but based on some preliminary research that I've done, it seems like something, on the order of 40 to 50 feet of width away from the existing and proposed bridges. It seems like that will account for the construction access that we're looking to build the project. And again, those are the types of numbers we're looking for. We're not looking for 28 feet and 6.5 inches or things like that. And again, to reinforce what this is for, we need to make sure that the construction equipment does have room to access this area, carry the beams in, and build the project. Okay, so now we're going to go through the same thing about the A3M as we did through the concept team meeting, somewhat straightforward, but what information do we have available to us to have these discussions? Well, we have something that I'm calling A3M plans or even layouts. They don't even necessarily have to be cut plan sheets yet, but we have a decent amount more information than we did at the concept team meeting. Primarily, we have the locations of the ESAs identified, clear as day on the plans or layouts themselves. That's a major difference. We should have by this point all of our survey information in topography and property. Our horizontal and vertical alignments should be pretty well established at this point, so much so that we can have a preliminary run of cross sections and have some limits to talk about. We want to recognize that at the A3M timeframe, we still do not know what the proposed span configuration, vent locations, and substructure type will be. And again, this was a challenge that we went through in the past trying to figure this out, and we weren't really able to connect the dots until this new approach of increased flexibility for design and construction. So the unknown that's fallen off here is really the vertical alignment, which needs to be established here to run cross sections. Now we're going to move from the development milestones into what I'm calling the check milestones. So again, somewhat controversially, or at least seemingly, I'm considering constructability to be one of those check milestones along with the field plan reviews. The intent here is the main discussion to be confirming our previous educated guesses with respect to these two main questions. Are we planning to allow or not allow the use of temporary jetties? And what is that approximate width outside the bridges for temporary construction access? At the constructability review meetings, you're going to have even more information. The geometry, including the cross section, should be very well established, and we should have a set of staging plans that can be evaluated in detail by construction personnel. Typically, at the constructability review meeting, at least the first one, we still do not know the proposed bridge span configuration, vent locations, or substructure type. My next slide is talking about both field plan review meetings. Again, some of this is very simple, but reinforcing the fact that we are confirming our previous educated guesses on these two topics. The sources of information are very straightforward, the plans themselves. We're really getting into a full, complete plan set of these two milestones. Unknowns are diminishing. By the time we go to PFPR, we know the vent locations because we have the preliminary bridge layout in hand for that meeting. By the time we get to FFPR, we should also have the BFI and therefore all the substructure details worked out. So by the time we get to FFPR, really there shouldn't be any unknowns. It's nice to confirm and check back. But again, if you're doing this after lockdown plans, we're really too late to be having that discussion. So that wraps up my discussion on the PD, kind of walking you all through the PDP milestones, how I'm thinking through them and walking through chronologically. It's talking about the guidance for these plans. Y'all have probably seen draft versions of this for a long time now. We are in the final phase of updating it for this new approach, and it will be released with the next version of the plan presentation guide. So that the format here should be very recognizable to designers. They're the primary audience of the PPG, but we envision environmental and project managers also utilizing this somewhat as a checklist just to make sure we're on the same page. As before, in order to help with some consistency and efficiency, we'll be creating a CAD cell library or a template for these notes so that the designers can just pull this down off one of their menus in the CAD software and edit them from there if needed, which again, we think is rare, but it'll save some time and help with consistency. I do want to mention that we are very much looking forward to all feedback from this audience and beyond on the process itself, any specific guidance documents we have like the PPG. So please feel free to send those in through the chat right now or through after the meeting by contacting one of us. So my next slide is going to go to the PDP, the plan development process. My intent here is really to just recognize that the current PDP manual does address these ideas. But we may want to revisit some of the words here and also take some of this guidance from the A3M and let it trickle into other guidance that's floating out there for these meetings. And what I mean by that, a couple of examples would be the Environmental Services Guidebooks, and Office of Program Delivery has various templates for agendas and meeting minutes and things like that. So we do see minor updates, but not major, to those guidance documents. So this is just a screenshot from the PDP where I'm highlighting some things that jumped out to me, basically recognizing that this discussion can happen at the A3M. And similarly, for the constructability review meetings, there is language in the PDP that already talks about this as a goal and recognizes the permanent construction detail sheets here. And then in the documentation, it again mentions that along with special provisions, the information gained from that constructability review should be consistent with these drawings. Now, keep in mind, this was written in the old methodology. So there will be minor tweaks here, moving things slightly earlier in the PDP, but to zoom out, it still is a preliminary design PDP activity, as Chris mentioned. I want to summarize with some takeaways here from all three of us, Don, Chris, and myself. Just reiterate the fact that this is a prolonged effort of collaboration. And it is a team effort that needs to start early in the process. And again, the goal, and I think it reinforces this even more, is to limit those changes once it's submitted. The Section 20 plans are needed for environmental tech studies. This is the main primary goal here, is that first milestone target set that I mentioned, preliminary plans to other offices. So those are very important for environmental tech studies. As Chris mentioned in his presentation, when you have certain consultation needed, this process won't apply. And that's just going to have to be a project by project discussion, but there are some types of projects where we will still need to stick to the old process. We feel like this Section 20 approach is ready to be starting to be utilized immediately. And again, the primary PDP goal here is to submit those on baseline schedule, the Section 20 plans to environmental, and have them not be revised through lockdown plan submission. And again, a reminder to please give us feedback on any guidance that's currently published and the draft guidance that we'll provide after this presentation. So thank you all very much for your time and attention. This is my last slide here. This wraps up the first presentation of 2 in this session. So you're seeing contact information for the 3 presenters here. And I think we have about 15 minutes or so to take questions that might have come through on the Q&A.
Yeah, we've had a few questions come in that asked if we could share the slides for this presentation. This presentation will be posted along with the Q&A to a website, and Gail Davina, who is helping us out, is about to publish that link in the announcements. So keep an eye on the announcements in that Q&A, and you should have a link to that soon. So thanks for all those questions, and we definitely want to get the material out to you. We do have a number of questions, so let's see if we can get through those. And if more questions come up, we hope to have a little bit of time at the end of today's session to be able to come back to any questions we may miss. Otherwise, look again for that Q&A that will be posted at that website. So the first question comes from Stephen Holland. Are temporary detour bridges ever shown on Section 20 plans? If not, is that activity shown on just Section 19 plans? This is temporary detour bridges.
And this is Don digging with Bridge. I can handle that first, and maybe Sam can clarify. So we have in the past shown both, if there's a need, a detour bridge, the proposed bridge itself, the existing bridge, and also if there's a work bridge needed. You need all those structures shown to make an assessment of where your impacts are going to be. I've also seen it too, and we can clarify this. where instead of section 20, you end up sometimes in earlier iterations of section 20 that ended up being all 19 series because it's, well, that's where you were showing a lot of your staging. So, but primarily to that question, I would say, yes, you'd be showing those detour bridges. Sam, what do you think?
Yes, I would agree. It's a great question. I'm thinking a little bit on the fly, but yes, they would go in there. So you would have, you know, if you've got a temporary bridge, at least in my experience, you're detailing that in pretty good specificity on the construction staging plans, the 19 series. So then again, I'm thinking out loud here, then at that point, you've got a layout of 2 bridges. You know where your existing bridge is, you know where your detour bridge is. And then but they still need to build the detour bridge and temporary bridge. So then it falls right back in my head into that model of offsetting from those 2 bridges, enough room to construct them and going from there.
I would agree for whatever it's worth. We had another question, and it is, when should the section 20 be started for LIBPs for the low impact bridge program?
I will, since that program's in my office, I'll answer that. LIBPs are a special case. Their schedules are very, I would say, short, and a lot of tasks are quick pace. So to that question, and if we're going with, we are going with this new method, for LIBPs, there's always a constant that you know what the existing bridge is that's out there. So you start planning on how to approach removing that bridge. And to that end, as soon as roadway starts working up their plans, you can start your section 20 sheet as well. And then having a draft at that point, really for engineers, project team folks to look at, is the best approach to do that. So to that question, as early as possible when you start developing plans as far as roadway. Sam, what do you think about that?
I'll mostly defer to you, Don, on that because I have limited experience, but I did intend to say, but overlooked it in my presentation, that the workflow we took y'all through on that PDP Appendix O, we recognize that does not directly apply to every program that the department has, like LIBP. So we might need to work that out in a little more detail.
From my experience with LIBPs, you're oftentimes going out and doing a site visit with folks, and during that time, you're having a lot of conversations about whether you're going to be able to clear span the potential length of beams, and you're not going to finalize that yet, but you're going to have some of those conversations that you might be having on regular projects at the concept team meeting, and some of those conversations that you're going to have at the atrium as well. So I think the hope is that you would be able to produce that fairly early. If you need any right-of-way on an LIBP, then we're going to have to complete tech studies by that right-of-way date. And so we'll definitely need it for those tech studies. Otherwise, we need to see that those plans early on so that we can verify that all of our resources are delineated appropriately. But we otherwise wouldn't need, if you don't have right-of-way, we may not actually need that section 20 plan sheet until we receive lockdown plans, which is when we would, in most cases, be doing our AOEs if we don't need right of way. But hopefully in this new approach, it's very easy to develop those early on.
And Chris, I want to, thanks for bringing that up. Yes, that conversation starts really early for LIBPs at the field scoping meeting. So I would say it's going to be an early start there. The conversation at least are starting. Those conversations should be captured, documented, and as Sam said, along the way, you are making sure that guess is being confirmed by each portion of the project team, whether it's designers, construction, utilities, no right of way in this case. So yeah, that as early as possible for LIBP at the field scoping meeting.
Great. Next question is, how do we handle section 54, which are BMP locations, if we don't have a layout?
So I'll again tackle this, and I will put a caveat. I'm thinking this question tends to be maybe for the northern districts 1 and 6. I think same thing. Those sheets are going to be in flux. You might know that you're going to have to get in for an existing bridge into the water, and in this case, maybe disturb the bank. So at that earlier portion, that stream bank stabilization, which is not, in essence, not part of the bridge end roll detail that we have on bridge plans, but in addition to, that's going to be shown on the 54, and I would maybe suggest showing it on 13, just so for completeness sake that you have riprap shown in 2 different places that can confirm that you need that stream bank stabilization. Because in the end, that armoring is a erosion control measure. Sam, what do you think?
I think I'll just concur because I'm not sure that I fully understand the question itself. So maybe this is something we can get with whoever asked that question to make sure I understand.
All right. We've got 2 related questions, and I'm going to read them both and address them both because they're on the environmental side. How are these larger permitted access areas being permitted / impacts calculated? And then the second question, are ecologists supposed to report the full hashed area as a fill impact, even though the majority of work bridges aren't a 404 impact? If so, how do we discuss in reports that avoidance and minimization measures have occurred if we are allowing fill that is not necessary to construct the project? So the main thing I think we need to be thinking about as we describe impacts, we are actually increasing the permanent impact that we are calculating for projects a good bit here, because we are allowing for that bank stabilization. So forget everything that's happening in the stream for a second and just focus on that bank stabilization. So if we think that we have riprap that is going to extend, and we will calculate from the extent of that area that where they potentially could go out, that hatched area, all the way down through the existing and proposed bridges, all the way down to the other side, that hatched area, that will all now be calculated as permanent impact, permanent fill impact for that bank stabilization. So that's an impact that you will now need to calculate on any Section 20 plan sheet that carries that note that allows that template plan note, the number 1 that allows that bank stabilization. The area within, the main thing that we need to know is if we're going to have any, basically a rock jetty, and that's what that 3rd plan note is about. Says is a rock jetty required, or is it not required? If it's not required, then we will say that we that we will use a temporary work bridge or other method that will not be a 404 impact. And again, since we're calculating always what the biggest impact is, we have that fill impact that goes along the entire stream bank. So things that we do within, we're now going to describe what we may be doing. It may be cofferdams, it may be a temporary work bridge, it could be any number of things. We're not going to dictate what the contractor will do, just give our idea of what might happen, but say that that area is within the larger fill impact of that bank stabilization. If you have a rock jetty, then it's going to be the same thing. It's essentially, it always will be within that hatched area. So we will have already calculated that for bank stabilization, which is the same type of impact fill, calculating it on a linear basis along the stream. And so we are not going to dictate exactly where that is or where the fingers might be. Just say that we will have a rock jetty within that larger impact that is already being calculated as a permanent fill. So we're going to be less prescriptive in calculating exactly what those impacts within the hatched area are, because we are calculating that as a permanent impact along the bank for bank stabilization. Anything that I missed there? Sam, Don, and Dave, I know you're on the call as well. Anything you want to chime in there? All right. The next question, and hopefully we can get through a couple more of these, is the 33% stream width blockage related to the normal stream width, bank to bank width, or width at any given time, including flood events? This is a tricky question, and that's a tricky question because our regional permits say one thing, but how it's practically applied is that we are using that boundary on the plan sets. That's really the only thing that we can use to really calculate on. And so whatever is shown on the plans as being the stream edge, that's the percentage that we are going to go by. Dave, I'll let you jump in here again if you disagree, but I think that's not exactly what it says in the regional permits, but how it's being applied. Next question comes from Fletcher Miller. Section 20 is construction staging detours in the current PPG. Will offsite detour plans remain in this section?
Hey, Fletcher, I don't think so. No, I think we will take this new permanent access construction details. This will become the new section 20 formally in the PPG, and the offsite detours, I think, will move to a different section. And I can't remember off the top of my head which one that is, but I do from memory, there's a nearby section where it also fit nicely. So as you can tell, I haven't really thought that through fully, but that's what I'm currently thinking.
All right. Are you saying constructability reviews are no longer on the plan process or schedule with this new process? You say that it's not really possible to have it.
I guess I'll attempt to answer that. It's possible, but it's a challenge. It would be a challenge to do that with our current schedule template, is what I would say. The main point here, I think, is it's hard to, this is such a new idea that it's hard to get out of that old mindset. So the main point, I think, is this new process allows us to get a quality section 20 plan without a formal constructability review. And the one kind of personal add-on I would say is, don't take that as discouraging a constructability review. If you don't have all the information required to do that, you can do a quick concept level gut check, if you will, based on hatched layouts, if you want to get a little bit more confidence in the section 20 plan. But really, that would just be an additional step with that, not really necessary. If you're having these robust conversations as much as possible at the two earlier milestones, the concept and the plan.
Sam, I'd like to add to that. So what I've seen and experienced through the development of these Section 20 in the past and recently is make sure as a designer or project team, one of the big key things is you vet your approach on the plans and the permits with construction and also in tandem with bridge office. Sam said you want to verify or confirm that your approach is feasible based on what our construction folks experienced in the past, and specifically bridge construction is a lot of times specialized. So you do want to bring in those state bridge liaisons to vet out and say, hey, in this, let's say D5, this is, it's going to be on the coastal. You're really going to be doing barge work, or what they've seen before as far as environmental restrictions or what to look out for. So not, as Sam said, not to discourage constructability. They can take those, that can be in a form of, hey, that can take over or be part of your monthly updates. Do bring in your respective construction, whatever project area or district you're in, but have those conversations and have those confirmations from construction.
All right, we are out of time for questions. That being said, Don has to check out, I think, after this Q&A session, and there's one more question I'd like to get to you, Don, which is, it is difficult to locate information from years ago for older bridges or projects. Where would team members locate the previous records Sam said to look for bridges?
So for that, a lot of our project starts with our bridge hydraulics team. So as you work with our liaisons, our bridge office liaisons, send that request through them, the review, or through we have a general bridge office email, and we can provide that. You could also see that same email if you Google bridge office, GDOT bridge office org chart, and you'll see that bridge office email. Send those requests in as far as, hey, we're looking, we can't find the existing plans, or is there an existing BFI available? So we can process that and get that to you, because that information does help quite a bit early on.
All right, we have a number of really great questions that we're not going to have time to get to right at this very moment. I do want to say that we will try to save some time at the end to come back to these questions. But if we don't manage to get to your question, then Gail put a link into the chat. Please check that, and we will post all the Q&A, and we will write written responses to each one of those questions and place it there so that we make sure that we get you the information you need. So thank you very much to Don and to Sam. And with that, I think we can pass it over to Dave Hedin.
Hey there, everyone. This is Dave Hedin. I am here to talk to you all about construction envelope permitting. This is a concept that has grown out of a couple of origins, and we're going to talk about the origins of this concept. We're also going to talk about how we might prepare to approach it. So in terms of the applications and limitations of this concept, we're going to dig into what opportunities and constraints we're confronting with this. We are going to explore some of the potential benefits, including how to minimize project delays, rework, etc., by applying this concept appropriately. And then we're going to talk about the requirements for implementation on GDOT projects. You know, what we've just spoken about, what you've heard from Don and Sam and Chris about, has to do with a very similar concept that, you know, they are continuing to develop this approach to more informed permitting, if you will, and or at least more permitting that better anticipates the activities required at the project site. So before I dig all the way into the weeds on this, I did zoom out to give folks context, because I think this is important. Also, it just so happens that yesterday was the anniversary of a very important event in American history, especially as it applies to the Section 20 plans, especially as it applies to construction envelope permitting. And so to talk about what happened yesterday, 52 years ago, I'll pause and just say, if you take a look at the Earth from far away, you'll notice there's a lot of water. Water is obviously critical for life on Earth, all life on Earth, in fact. Close to 70% of the Earth's surface is covered by water. That also happens to be a similar amount of water that we all carry around in our bodies. So if you don't think water is essential, think different. In terms of why we wound up with the laws that we have related to water, I'm going to talk about what happened on this date yesterday, just over 50 years ago. Here's the thing about water. It follows a very predictable path, everybody, and I appreciate we're here to talk about engineering and permitting, but again, I'm trying to break this down to some basic fundamental truths for people to follow the rationale behind all of this. So indulge me for just a moment here. this water cycle is one of the most exciting sort of discoveries of my young life when I learned about it. And basically, for those who might not have followed the path of natural resources study that I did, I want to share with you that water is it's a finite resource, and B, it's forever changing. And so the water in the oceans evaporates, the water in our lakes evaporates too. So it goes into the air. It becomes cloud vapor, which then condenses and rains or snows as precipitation back onto the Earth's surface. Water then runs off into receiving waters, all of the different kinds of waters you can imagine, ponds, lakes, streams, rivers, wetlands. And it also percolates through the soil as groundwater. So this is a very basic representation of this water cycle. Again, we're on Earth, it's mostly water. This cycle is critical to our lives. So what's the big deal about what happened 50 years ago or so? Well, if you can believe it, for approximately I think it was actually the 11th time in about 100 years, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio caught fire. This was, again, not the first time the Cuyahoga River had caught fire, but it was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. And so national attention was paid to water rights and the importance of clean water. And from this, a great deal of laws were created. Incidentally, Earth Day was also partly inspired by this event, or at least people coalesced around this event and said, look, we need to be more thoughtful about how we approach our resources, the ones that are vital to our lives, to our commerce, to the functioning of our ecosystems, as well as our economies. And so what we've got out of this are a variety of permits. And in terms of permits, these are permissions or authorizations granted from agencies to developers like GDOT in order to have impacts in those water resources or upon those water resources. One of the biggest permit grantors coming out of this, and certainly the most impactful law coming out of this anniversary that occurred yesterday, was the Clean Water Act of 1972, which really reset the expectation of the Environmental Protection Agency on how America was planning to keep its water clean. And also the EPA saw fit to grant permitting authority under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I think we can all agree that water is important. I think we can all agree that water ought not to burn. Obviously, it wasn't the water burning, it was contaminants on the water in Cleveland, a very industrial city. But nonetheless, because water is a shared resource that crosses state boundaries, the federal government had to step in and take control over what was at the time a hodgepodge of regulations state by state that in effect did not adequately protect the water. Now, say what you will about regulation and say what you will about whether or not we're adequately protecting water or too much protecting water today. I'll just tell you that working with the regulators at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers every day, they have a job to do, and it is in part to confirm that our activities, that GDOT's activities, are in fact legal and authorized under the Clean Water Act. So 404 permits were created by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to allow for development of water resources or fill, et cetera, modification of water resources. And these permit authorizations are critical to GDOT's functioning. So when you think schedules, you've got to think permits. When you think project delivery, your permit can be your critical path. So here we are in the South Atlantic the division of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We're in the Savannah district, which is the headquarters for the state of Georgia. I believe the regional headquarters are here in Atlanta for the South Atlantic division, but nonetheless, we correspond with folks in Savannah and also at satellite offices at the Lake Lanier office, as well as in an office that is on the south side of Atlanta here. So in terms of these permits, I do want to just remind everyone that we have several different permits that we might use. There are different programs. available to GDOT. And you heard Chris talk about this just a moment ago, discussing regional permits versus nationwide permits. I'll just, again, trying to lay some foundations here, because I think that when we get into this more deeply, it's helpful for folks who maybe are not ecologists to understand this. I think ecologists, probably this is their bread and butter, and they've learned these regulatory rules, et cetera, and they work with these permits day in, day out. But for everyone else, project managers, designers, other folks on the project team, other environmental SMEs, I just want to share with you that some basics, which are that the nationwide permit program is issued every 5 years out of Washington, D.C. So those are called nationwide permits, NWPs. And every 5 years they expire and they're re-upped. Similarly, there's regional permits that are issued by each district. So within Savannah District, we have regional permits that were created explicitly for GDOT projects, if you will, transportation projects. And so regional permits, or RGP 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, and 35, these are the GDOT specific permits. Now, other applicants, these are available to other applicants as well, but they were developed in coordination with GDOT. And although there are some stumbling blocks in there, such as the 33% restriction within those regional permits, we cannot exceed 33% of a channel blockage when working within a stream. That's one of the quote unquote conditions, requirements within the regional permits. They also have much higher thresholds. And so those impact thresholds are critical to us, because if you can't fit beneath a nationwide permit threshold of X number of acres or linear feet of impacts, and you can't fit under the thresholds for a regional permit, then your option is effectively to pursue an individual permit. Now, again, I'm covering a lot of basic information, but I think that not everyone in attendance has dealt directly with 404 permits. So please bear with me. We're almost done with this elementary primer on permitting. In terms of obtaining these permits, we have to demonstrate avoidance and minimization, which is to say that everything you just heard about Section 20 plans is applicable across the entire project area in terms of trying to demonstrate to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, in this case, that we are making a good faith effort not to have the worst impacts we might anticipate on these waters. We do take pains throughout our project development process, starting from the A3M and going all the way through FFPR to continue to tweak this. Now, if we tweak things at FFPR, as you all know, that can be after lockdown plans, for those of you familiar with the PDP. And if we get there, we can wind up having to redo a permit that we already applied for. So there's some rework examples that might come up if we discover too late that we're going to change or especially increase impacts from a given project. So late changes, late design changes at FFPR, if they are within ESAs, environmentally sensitive areas such as wetlands or streams, which are 404 waters, if those changes affect those resources, we may have to reapply. And that is too late for us in GDOT to make our on-time environmental certification. If we're reapplying at or after FFPR, we've basically missed the LET certification, and we risk either a late certification or a conditional certification. So these are not desirable circumstances. So thank you for sitting through the primer. I did want to put all this out there so that you all understand the context of the innovation that is being implemented through construction envelope permitting. I do want to, I mentioned origins, and one of the origins of this approach that we are trying to, or that we are applying across the entire project area for some projects, it is very similar to the Section 20 approach that you just heard, in terms of the concept is very much the same. Let's, as members of a project team, let's think about where construction, where the contractor will require access, and not just put the blinders on and say, oh, this is the extent of fill. Obviously, the extent of fill is a very important sort of delimitation on the plans, but it's nowhere near the full story in terms of where a contractor may require access within these 404 jurisdictional waters. Those are the waters that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers regulates, which obviously includes streams, rivers, wetlands, etc. There is one other origin that's important to consider here, and that is our design build program. And so whether we're following design bid build or design build, we do still have to obviously obtain these permit authorizations from the U.S. Army Corps prior to letting our projects and constructing them. And so, see, it gets complicated when you try and talk about design bid build and design build at the same time, because obviously that first let on a design build could come very, very early, does come very early because design is continuing post-let. So anyhow, my point in all of this is to say that design build encountered a need early on in GDOT's, as GDOT grew its P3 and design build programs. What was encountered was, this issue of, well, we're getting to 30% costing plans, and that's what we've got at let, but how are we going to obtain a permit if we were to obtain that before let? And so I do want to acknowledge that not all permits in design build are expected to be obtained before let. That has been a practice that has been, I believe, pretty well implemented for us, but within GDOT. But I will say that some projects may get pushed past the actual initial let date for design build, and that a permit authorization would be obtained after that. That NTP 1 especially. So anyway, design build had a need for trying to anticipate where a contractor would go without dictating to the contractor not just his means and methods for access, but also without having a complete design, if you will. We aren't working with 100% plans in the design build realm. And so as a result of our efforts with Section 20 and our acknowledgement that we don't want to operate with blinders on, we're considering construction access, and as a result of innovations coming out of our Office of Innovative Delivery, this idea of the construction envelope emerged. All right, all important at GDOT, as everyone knows, is our schedules. Our project schedules are very important. And in terms of some milestones, I did just put up some basics here. I appreciated all of Sam's points about meetings and coordination. Obviously, communicating among project teams is key for project delivery. And those touch points, those coordination points, from concept all the way through let, can be very helpful, very informative, and prevent mistakes down the road or anticipate potential issues and avoid them. So there's a lot of work being done as this blue arrow proceeds, if you will, through the course of a project schedule. But I want to draw your attention to the avoidance and minimization measures meeting, as well as the lockdown plans. And so the A3M is critical, as you've heard. It helps us initiate this conversation with designers, us ecologists, and other environmental SMEs. We have an opportunity to engage with designers and other members of the project team about what the project will require in terms of environmental impacts and therefore permits, agency consultation, and so on. Prior to right-of-way authorization, it is GDOT's process to engage with the agencies, and coming out of preliminary design, we should be getting concurrences from agencies that is needed, such as U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, both of which have a Section 7 role. That's Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, another major federal act that comes to us from the 70s. But I will say that this agency consultation happens early on. It's after we've done avoidance and minimization, obviously, but before we're into final plans. And so once we get into final plans, final plan development, we do encounter eventually the lockdown date. Now, I'll remind everyone this lockdown date is intended to be the time at which designers are going to put their pencils down, at least as it pertains to environmentally sensitive areas, which again, in this case, is referring to 404 jurisdictional waters such as wetlands and streams. So 38 weeks prior to let, if it's an individual permit, or 31 weeks prior to let, if it is a general permit, which are the nationwides and regionals, GDOT ecologists need to be preparing and submitting an application for the 404 impacts, as well as buffer variants, as well as any other attendant permits that we may require, although these are the two big ones. And frankly, the 404 permit is by far the most relevant to GDOT's process across the board. We get more 404 permits than buffer variances by an order of magnitude. And that's partly, I won't go into that as to why that is, but that's just one of the facts, is that 404 permits are fairly universally applicable. So this is not, this is kind of an uncomfortable situation for designers, and it's an uncomfortable situation for environmental SMEs as well, that even before FFPR, when there's another opportunity to talk through these things, it's supposed to be pencils down within those ESAs. This is just a vestige of, the negotiations that were undertaken years ago now to try and offer a stopping time when ecologists could knowingly apply for or confidently apply for a permit authorization without the expectation that a designer will come back and say, oh, we changed this. We're going to now need this much area instead of that much area, which for an ecologist means re-up your permit, redo it. And that's not desirable for all kinds of reasons, most of all schedule and resources. We don't need to be doing rework, and we don't need to be setting up delays at the last minute. And so I go through all this elementary, this basic sort of interpretation of our existing process as it relates to 404 permit authorizations, because what we're proposing to do here, and what we have done in a limited number of projects so far, is implement the CEP concept, which is to say the construction envelope permitting concept. So this concept acknowledges that and anticipates the access needs of the contractor. From a functional perspective, this is very similar to what folks who have worked on GDOT project teams before are familiar with in terms of, employing orange barrier fence. That is our best tool as ecologists to advise a contractor. Beyond this point, we did not anticipate environmental impacts within ESAs, and so, do not pass, do not go beyond here. Obviously, there's some practical, challenges related to orange barrier fence, both its display on the plans and its utilization in the field, but it has proven to be a very effective tool. It's the best one we've got for trying to communicate all the way through time to a contractor from when we are, getting permits for plans. So one of the things that we're trying to, vet with this approach is how this can best be applied in different scenarios on GDOT projects. So I already mentioned that design build and design bid build projects are involved or have been involved. We do have a body of pilot projects that we began on a couple of years ago, if you can believe it, bridges that we sat down with each project team, with project manager and the ecologist at the very least, to talk about how would we be able to anticipate potential additional design changes through time without going right of way to right of way, which is, kind of the worst case scenario for resource impacts, but also with allowing a contractor enough room to construct slopes and structures that they'll need. And so this is the balancing act that is incorporated into Section 20 coordination, as well as this construction envelope permitting concept. So in application, here you are at A3M. The working draft would be developed, by during the conversation between the environmental SMEs, particularly the ecologist, as it pertains to 404 waters, and the designers. And so acknowledging that there's constraints along a given roadway, and perhaps jogging the access areas to go around a wetland, for example. I will also say that, just looking at this image on the right, there are different schools of thought about what is most appropriate for, GDOT in terms of right-of-way purchases and then access. And I think this is a tension that is difficult for us to solve, because for those of us in the environmental office, we are very focused on pre-construction delivery. And then for others who may feel differently about how to, maintain or protect aspects of the right-of-way, looking at the operational efficiency, the safety, the maintenance cost, et cetera, the upkeep, there's a tension there between conservation and maintenance, or conservation and development, however you want to say it. Be that as it may, in the paradigm of project delivery, we are very much focused on avoidance and minimization, and it is incumbent upon us, the applicant, to demonstrate that we are avoiding and minimizing where possible. Look, if we need to touch this wetland at the bottom of this image, if we need to have a fill slope get in there, et cetera, if it's unavoidable and a wall is impracticably expensive, that is what the permit is for. If we can demonstrate to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that this is a, quote, unavoidable impact, then we can get a permit for it. I will remind everyone that mitigation looms large, and mitigation in terms of 404 permitting means something that it doesn't mean elsewhere, and that is mitigation credits exist to offset our impacts to 404 waters, and those credits cost money. So this is not just a constraint of time within the schedule. This is also a budgetary constraint. And in terms of this tension, in terms of this balance of avoidance and minimization, and yet allowing adequate access, this is a critically important thing to bear in mind. So anyhow, moving on, ecologists, after talking through this at the A3M and this reference to AMM efforts, that's avoidance and minimization and mitigation efforts, those are helpful to get on the table early enough in the process, because back to lockdown plans, if an ecologist comes to a designer during final plan development and asks for some consideration for a given resource, it's probably too late to efficiently modify or avoid for the designer. And that's part of where the A3M came from. Not just that was coming up at lockdown, but frankly, why start the conversation without the full knowledge of your constraints as a designer? That I think was part of what guided Sam Woods to help create the A3M itself. So talking early and often really helps this all go well. Coming out of that A3M, the preliminary plans are going to be provided by the designer, and corrected PFPR plans will, so this is where this is a potential innovation that I need to share with y'all. In this construction envelope permitting process that is being developed, the ecologist would assess the impacts to the limits of the construction envelope. Agency consultation, which, if you can recall the flow chart, agency consultation is happening early, prior to right-of-way. Again, that's to confirm with the lead federal agency, if it's FHWA and/or the Life Service and other agencies, that we're going to get the permission we need in order to move forward with the project before we buy right-of-way. We don't want to buy the right-of-way and then be told we can't do the project. So this is an important thing to get under our belts prior to authorizing that right-of-way. Now, here's the big twist for construction envelope permitting. In its ideal, in the concept that we've developed, there is a plan set called the corrected PFPR plans. I do not believe that consultants are necessarily submitting these. They are a deliverable, and so just want to acknowledge that in practice, I believe that what's happening out of PFPR is engineers are taking PFPR comments, revising the plans accordingly, and having that be the next stepping stone to final plans. So that's all great, and that's the way it's set up to work, and it works. It's a good process that GDOT has. What we are trying to innovate here is using those corrected PFPR plans, because everyone was just in the room, not just with A3M, not just with the constructability meeting, but coming out of PFPR, everybody was just in the room to talk about the project. So we should know what right of way we're buying. We should know where access, challenges exist. And if that's true, and if your project is not unduly complicated with several, potential stumbling blocks that I'll mention in just a second, but we do want to acknowledge there are some difficulties with applying it this way, but we've also demonstrated that it can be done. That using corrected PFPR plans, we could anticipate not only the contractor's access, but potential tweaks to the design. And so effectively anticipate the quote unquote elbow room needed for access and the reasonable maximum extent, if you will, of riprap along stream banks, which is a permitted activity if it gets below the ordinary high water mark. And so by anticipating those impacts this early in the process, coming out of PFPR, we have an opportunity to make application for permit authorization and have that out of the way well before it becomes the critical path. Now, there are risks inherent with this, and I think that GDOT understands and deals with risk in many ways on all of its projects. I don't want to offer this as a one-size-fits-all solution. I don't want to offer this. I don't want to suggest to anyone that now everyone should be prepared to make permit applications coming out of PFPR. That's not what I'm here to tell you. What I'm here to tell you is that has been done. We've demonstrated that it can be done effectively, and we've even demonstrated that by anticipating, say, additional riprap that would be required for District 1 bridges, if we anticipate that even moving forward and get an acceptable, we still demonstrate avoidance and minimization, we demonstrate the need for the riprap, we get the permit for it. Well, lo and behold, at least in one example, there were post-lockdown changes. They did stay within the construction envelope, and we did not need to re-permit that project. So that was an example of how this can be done and how it can pay, when it's done well, when folks are anticipating the impacts correctly, that this can actually go smoothly and help the project stay on track. I will say that lockdown plans, which is the traditional time for an ecologist to apply for a 404 permit, those are critically important as well. In this scenario that I've just described, lockdown plans don't go away. Say we've applied for a permit at corrected PFPR plans and we've obtained the permit authorization. Well, then lockdown plans are still a step in our PDP, and because they are, it provides us, I mentioned risk earlier, well, if we do still have that time built into our schedules, it's not a comfortable amount of time, but it is an adequate amount of time to address any permit changes. And so I want to say the risk of applying early is that you may guess wrong, you may not have anticipated everything that you needed to anticipate, and there may be a change, but look, there is the chance that you could catch that and revise it without delaying the project, because you still have to have the lockdown back check. By looking at the lockdown plans, we should be able to confirm whether or not that permit authorization is still valid, or if something has changed that would invalidate it, that would require us to reapply. The risk is that is you're doubling your effort. If you are going to come back and reapply, it probably wasn't the right choice to apply early in the first place. All right, so here it is. The big innovation on this is to move the permit and potentially buffer variance earlier in the process, coming out of PFPR and prior to the lockdown plans. So this is something, again, we're looking at essentially what's the design bid build model here. And this is something that we can demonstrate that we've been able to successfully do this. It has not been done on a wide range of projects, nor has it been done on a wide number of projects. And so I do want to introduce, unlike what you just heard about Section 20 from Don and Sam and Chris, who have really been developing that over the years. And granted, this has been in the works for years as well, but we are not as far down the path of integrating this approach into GDOT's typical process for plan development. So again, trying to explain what the benefits are here, that flexibility is huge. We pushed the avoidance and minimization earlier on, and we've already done that, systemically by having the A3M. That's in force on projects already. This would help improve adaptability, not only prior to let, but even after let in these design bid build scenarios where under construction, if you got that extra room and the contractor comes back and says, hey, I'm going to need this area here. Well, it's still within our permit, and we don't need to tell the contractor he has to stop and get a permit, or that we didn't get enough room and we have to go back and get the permit. So these are all benefits, potential benefits of this approach. I mentioned rework. That also includes re-coordination with the agencies or reapplication for these permit authorizations. And then I did, one of the most attractive parts of this concept is that no longer would the 404 permit be on the critical path for project delivery, which isn't just to get out of the, it's not that ecologists don't like holding the bag, but being the last person in that chain of hot potato can land us, behind the 8 ball, and it has. That's a lot of metaphors. So I do want to go back and continue to caution people that this is a concept that isn't universally. I don't think that it's wise to try and universally apply it at this time, and that's because several things. One is the risk of folks mistaking this or taking the liberty to think this is worst case permitting. It is not worst case permitting. This is a concept that has been discussed over the years, which is to say, if GDOT buys right of way, GDOT lays claim to impacting all of the resources within that right of way any way it wants, and it's not our right, frankly. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and this is a property rights debate that folks have sometimes, by legislating water, by regulating water, which crosses all property lines and all political boundaries, even GDOT, with all of its power as a state government agency, we are not independent or above that authority. And so we still do have a responsibility under federal law to follow the requirements of the 404 program, one of which is avoidance and minimization. Avoidance and minimization of resources doesn't translate well in the worst case scenario. So we want to stay away from worst case permitting. Other concerns are, large projects with complicated, wetland or stream systems associated with them that might warrant more consideration. All right, so here's the kicker, everybody. This all sounds great. We can move it up and apply early and get off critical path, and contractors happy, GDOT's happy, project managers are happy. Sounds wonderful, and it will be. It has been on a couple projects so far. But here's the thing: every regulatory requirement that applies, at lockdown is applying at this stage. And what that brings me to is several, important considerations that we've run into lately with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Maybe the most important of which has to do with culvert conditions. And those culvert conditions are requiring a great deal of scrutiny from the Corps with regard to our proposed culverts on perennial streams. I bring up this one instance to point out that unless we're able to satisfy the Corps with something, with design drawings that address their concerns related to perennial culverts, we're probably not going to have a permit through early permitting on a project that requires that anyway. They're going to probably require that we get there. So I just want to let everyone know that while this is a very desirable proposal from many angles, there are challenges that remain. We do anticipate additional workshops with practitioners. We do anticipate additional coordination with these agencies to make sure that when we roll this out more widely, that we're not going to hit a brick wall with the core. So there is still more legwork to do, but I didn't want to sit on this much longer and at least get this out to folks and let folks know what it is that we've been working on in terms of construction envelope permitting. So key takeaways, we've talked about these ad nauseum, and I'm running out of time. So I'll pause and see if there is any time left for questions.
Hey, Dave. We are right at 11 o'clock, but we'll get maybe one question in, and then hopefully any questions that do not get answered, we can post later at a later time when we post the presentation. Also, please note that I've been answering some questions in the chat, so look there if you got some questions about the Section 20 stuff.
Thanks for doing that.
Yeah. So, Dave, the first question is, when permits expire and are reissued, is GDOT required to reapply for the new reissued permit if a project is already under construction under the old?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's not necessarily a straight answer. In some cases, yes, absolutely. We need to have that permit in hand prior to expiration, if at all possible, so that we can switch on to the new permit. But the new regional permits do hold an option that they could roll over as long as conditions don't change. It's rare that conditions don't change on these 5-year programs, so I'd say most often you'd want to anticipate reapplication, Chris. Well, Chris, since I'm sorry I've burned out the clock here, and I know we don't have much time for more questions, I do just want to direct people a couple last things, housekeeping here. We have a bunch of environmental guidebooks. Construction envelope permitting, incidentally, is not yet contained in one of these guidebooks, but I do recommend that folks check these out. This replaces essentially the Environmental Procedures Manual, which GDOT has operated under for the previous decade. I do want to also direct everyone's attention that we have Tuesday, July 20th, as well as Wednesday, July 28th. We have 2 more summer series presentations coming up. And that one on the 28th is going to include myself and Sam Woods talking about the last thing I discussed, which is perennial stream culvert requirements. So please attend. It will affect your projects, and it's helpful to know what is being required under these current permits. Last thing, I will turn it over to Gail and just say thank you so much, Gail. I appreciate you setting this up, and thank you to my fellow presenters and to Chris Goodson for your help today.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Sam, and Chris. If you check the invite, you'll see my email address, and as Don mentioned, it has opening slides. If you would like a PDH CEU certificate, please request one within the next 2 weeks. That would be greatly appreciated. And Brian, as always, thanks so much for all you do to make these sessions happen.